If you spill tea on the tablecloth again, you'll be sent away like your mother. These words sounded like a slap in the face. Not for the first time, not for the last. I stood in the middle of the dining room, holding a tray of dishes, and listened to the owner's granddaughter again show who was lady and who was nobody. My name was Sophia. I had lived in this house since childhood. My mother worked as a maid for the Lewandowski family for over 20 years. After her death, they allowed me to stay, but only under conditions that were more like slavery. I had no days off. I had no personal space. I had no voice. I was never called by name. Only, "Hey, you! Bring this. Wipe the floor. Why are you still here?" And I didn't say anything. Not because I was weak, but because I had nowhere else to go. I slept in the room where they used to keep rooms. I ate leftovers from the kitchen. And every day I heard that I would never achieve anything. But the only thing that kept me going was my old man, the head of the family, Mr. Artur Lewandowski, the only one who never shouted at me in all those years. He always spoke calmly. He looked me straight in the eye. And whenever others humiliated me, he would silently call me to his office, give me a book, a piece of chocolate, or just be quiet by my side. He was the only person who saw me as someone more. And it was he who once told me quietly, "Sophia, remember, everything in this house will change someday, and then no one will be able to look down on you anymore." I did not understand what he meant, but I remembered his words, especially that evening when my granddaughter spat words at me again. "You can get used to it," she hissed. "You'll be worthless all your life." I just looked at her, and for the first time, I felt not resentment inside me. It was a premonition, because something was telling me that they had no idea how much things were going to change. Saturday, another family gathering. It was one of those evenings when I had to be everywhere, but nowhere to stay. I had to clean the living room, set the table, cook, make sure that the wine was served to the right people, and most importantly, not to be seen. "Sophia, the guests will be here in an hour." "Is everything shiny?" shouted Mrs. Marina, Mr. Arthur's eldest daughter. "Yes," I answered quietly, and louder. "I'm used to it." They always wanted me around, but at the same time reminded me that I was not a part of this house. At 1800 hours, the first cars appeared. I saw black and glossy cars pull up one after another. People in expensive coats and smiling for the camera entered the house, greeted each other, hugged each other, not because they were happy to see each other, but because it was a game in which they were actors. I stood to the side, in the shadow of the kitchen door. "Oh, you're still here." Arthur's granddaughter Dasha called out to me. "Remember, don't touch the table, don't look at us, don't breathe loudly." While they were sitting at the table, I served food. No one thanked me. No one looked me in the eye. "Is she still here?" one of the nephews asked. "Hasn't Grandpa kicked her out yet?" "Let him keep her," Dasha smiled. "She's like furniture. It's just there, not in the way." I gritted my teeth. But as I walked to the fireplace with the tray, I overheard part of the conversation between Arthur's sons. "After the funeral, we'll deal with the real estate right away," one whispered. "I'll take the cottage and the yacht. You take the apartment in the capital. And this one." The other nodded in my direction. "Of course, as soon as we sign the papers." I froze. Get rid of it. As if I were trash. A thing. They had already divided the inheritance while the old man was still alive. And most importantly, they had no doubt that everything would go to them. I went to the kitchen and pretended not to hear anything. But the words were getting louder in my head. Get rid of it. Even then I did not know that very soon they would have to get rid of it. It is night. The house is quiet. The guests had left, and even Dasha didn't make any noise. Apparently, she was too tired from her own arrogance. I had already gathered the dishes and was heading for the closet when I suddenly heard, "Sophia, come here, please." It was him, Mr. Arthur. I had always had a special respect for him, and not only because he was the owner. He never yelled, never devalued, never looked down on me. He saw me. He saw me as a person. I walked into his office, spacious, old, filled with the smell of wood and tobacco. He was sitting in a chair by the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket. He looked weaker than usual. His face was pale and his hands were trembling. "I'm sorry for calling you so late, but I wanted to talk to you before." He did not finish. "I'm listening, Mr. Arthur." Do you remember when you first came here with your mother? You were about 6 years old. I nodded. You asked if you could borrow books from the library. And when I said yes, you read them all. At the age of 6. I smiled. It was really a great happiness then. I saw how smart you were. I saw how you grew up, listened, memorized, and remained silent when others were shouting. And then I realized, this girl is not just a maid's daughter. She is strong. I could not say anything. My throat was tight. Sophia, I have made many mistakes. But the biggest one is that I allowed my family to treat you like a servant. I stared at him in silence. They had lost their humanity. And you, on the other hand, did not lose yourself, although you had every reason to. He leaned closer. You deserve a chance. And I want this house, everything here, to belong to you one day. I shivered. Mr. Arthur. Don't argue. It's already been decided. He smiled, but there was something parting in his eyes. Promise me one thing. When the time comes, don't be afraid. They will scream, threaten, and despise you. But you are stronger than that. I nodded. I promise. He sighed and leaned back. Good girl. That was our last conversation. He did not wake up the next morning. On the day of the funeral, everything looked like a theater performance. Expensive black coats, ordered wreaths with gold embossing, tears on the faces of people who were laughing at the table yesterday, discussing who would inherit what. I stood aside, at the very end of the ceremony, closer to the fence, where no one would see me. I was not invited. I came by myself. They walked by without looking in my direction. Dasha defiantly threw an oblique glance in my direction, whispering, You don't belong here. But I didn't budge. I had to say goodbye to the only person who saw something more in me. When the coffin was lowered into the ground, I could hardly hold back my tears. But I didn't let them fall. After the funeral, everyone went to the estate. The conversation was already about how to divide the inheritance. If he was in his right mind, he would have left everything to his sons, someone said. No, most likely to his daughter Marina, since she was his errand girl, suggested another. And this one, Dasha glanced in my direction, she'll only get her mother's broom. I remained silent. While the others were laughing, a man in a dark suit with a leather folder in his hands knocked on the door of the mansion. I asked everyone to gather in the living room. I am the notary of Mr. Artur Lewandowski. Everyone was instantly quiet. The moment they had been waiting for had arrived. I was about to leave the room when he stopped me. You too, Miss Sophia. This concerns you directly. I froze. The relatives turned in my direction, first in surprise, then in anger. Why should she be here? Dasha hissed. She is not from our family. It's Mr. Arthur's request, the notary replied calmly. Everyone hissed. I walked past them and sat down. Not in the corner, not in the doorway, right in front of the notary, because something in me knew. Everything was about to change. There was a tense silence in the living room. Everyone seemed to be sitting there without breathing, waiting for their share of the millions to fall. Dasha, with her phone in hand, had already started recording a video in her story, ready to show off her new life. Ms. Marina was twirling a silver cross in her hands, maybe pretending to be grieving, or maybe just nervous. One of her nephews was looking around the room as if he had already seen his future office here. I sat quietly. Fear and confidence were fighting inside me. The notary opened a folder, put on his glasses, and began to read loudly and clearly. I, Arthur Ivanovich Lewandowski, in full consciousness, hereby declare my last will and testament. Everyone fell silent, and then the silence grew thicker with each phrase read. I leave all my property, including my estate, bank accounts, companies, jewelry, and land plots, to Sofia Mykolaievna Kovalenko. To me. At first there was a pause, as if the words had not been heard, as if the reality hadn't hit. And then there was an explosion. What? You're kidding me. This can't be true. Who is this? It's a mistake, Dasha screamed. She forged the documents. The notary remained calm. Everything was signed in the presence of witnesses. There's a video recording. Here it is. He turned on the tablet. Arthur is on the screen. Alive, calm, confident. This is my will. I know what I'm doing. She deserves this, and I am proud to leave it to her. Everyone fell silent. I looked at the screen, swallowing back tears. He didn't just say it. He did it. He gave me a chance. And in that moment, I realized for the first time, they have no power over me anymore. I am no longer a shadow in my own life. I am an heiress, an owner, a human being. After the video, there was a silence that cut through the air sharper than a scream. Everyone sat there, silent, not knowing what to do. And then there was an explosion of emotions. "It's not fair," Dasha shouted. "It's some kind of technical error." "He was of age. They could have forced him," said the younger nephew. "She's not even of our blood. She's just a servant." I sat there in silence, and for the first time in my life, I did not look down. I looked straight into each of their faces. "This is a fraud." Dasha jumped up, tearing the napkin holder off the table. "She manipulated Grandpa. She gained his trust to take away what was supposed to be ours." The notary remained unmoved. "All the documents are official. If you want, you can appeal in court, but your chances are minimal, to put it mildly." Marina, Arthur's eldest daughter, clutched her temples with her hands. "I raised the children, took care of him, and he all to her? Did she do more than us?" someone hissed from the side. And then I spoke. I spoke up. I didn't do more. I just didn't pretend. I didn't play roles. I was just me. And he saw that. They fell silent again. I stood up. "4 years you have treated me like furniture. Despised, ignored, insulted. But one person in this house saw who I really am. And now, whether you like it or not, all of this belongs to me." Dasha clenched her fists. "We'll see who gets kicked out of here." I moved closer to her and whispered, "Believe me, we will see. And very soon." I left the room without looking back. But inside I already knew. This is just the beginning. They will not stop. But now I will not back down. It's only been a week since the reading of the will, but I haven't felt peace for a moment. They did not give up. First, there were calls. One after another every day. "Sophia, let's talk. It's not human. We are a family." Then came the messages. My grandfather was old. It was easy to convince him. "Aren't you ashamed? You grew up in this house at our expense. You know that none of this is yours." And then they came, uninvited. I opened the door and saw the whole family on the porch. Marina, Dasha, 2 nephews, and some other aunt I didn't even remember by name. "We want to talk," Marina said, clutching a folder with some documents. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied calmly. "What do you mean, nothing?" Dasha exclaimed. "You live in our house, and what about us? Are we just supposed to watch you take everything away? This is not your house. It never was." I looked directly at her. "We'll get justice," she hissed. "You have no idea how many lawyers we've already hired." I can imagine. I took a step back, because I already have my own legal team. And believe me, mine is stronger. Marina came closer, no longer smiling. "We grew up in this house. You're just the maid's daughter. Don't confuse your role." I paused and answered quietly. "You have been confusing your role all your life. You thought that respect was acquired by birth, but it is earned by deeds." Dasha snapped. "I hate you." "It's mutual," I said calmly, "but now I have the keys." And I slammed the door on them. For the first time in years, I heard not an order, not disdain, but the sound of banging on a closed door. And I knew, this is not the end, but now I am in the center of the game, and I will not lose. After that scene at the door, I knew they would not stop, but I wasn't going to play the victim either. I acted. The first thing I did was call a lawyer and officially re-register the house and all the assets to myself. The second thing I did was to take a full inventory. All real estate, accounts, stocks, even antiques were now in my name. Thirdly, I filed documents to evict my relatives who were still living on the property in guest cottages. And then the real show began. Dasha came again, this time hysterical. "You have no right. This is my parents' house. My childhood was spent here. Mine too," I replied calmly. "It's just that yours was with a glass of champagne, and mine was with a rag in my hands." "We will sue," she shouted. "Try it," I smiled. "Do you have anything to lose?" She silently gave me a look full of hatred and left. Marina called 2 days later. "We can make a deal. If you, well, at least leave me some of it." You didn't leave me anything when you could. Why should I share? Because her voice began to tremble. It's not fair. It wasn't fair to humiliate me under your own roof for years. And I hung up the phone. The next day, the security guards escorted my relatives out of the estate on my behalf. They were leaving with suitcases, broken and humiliated. They, who had once mocked me in front of guests, now asked for silence and respect. I stood at the window, watching them load the cars. I felt no pity. They left me without everything. I left them without a home. And it was not revenge. It was justice. I knew that this was not a defeat for them. They did not know how to lose in silence. They would definitely try to come back. But this time I was not going to play on their terms. I did not publish photos from my house. I didn't go out with the press. I didn't brag about anything. I just started acting. Quietly, but definitely. I changed the security company to a private, more professional one. I installed cameras in all corners of the estate and around the perimeter. I blocked all bank cards that my relatives had ever had access to. I sent a request to the banks to check all the suspicious transactions that might have taken place before. And interestingly, I found a lot of strange things. Accounts that were regularly emptied. Fictitious payments for a service that never existed. Transfers to offshore companies signed by Dasha and Marina. I put together a dossier. I handed it over to my lawyer. "Are you sure you want to move forward with this?" he asked. I looked at him calmly. They thought I was stupid. They'd been stealing from the accounts since I was a floor cleaner. Now it's time to answer. He nodded. "All right then. I'll file a complaint with the financial inspectorate." That evening I received a voicemail from Dasha. Her voice was different. Not defiant. Not aggressive. It was scared. "Sophia, what are you doing?" It wasn't stealing. We thought Grandpa said it was okay. I didn't answer. It was just the beginning. They thought they had already lost everything. But they didn't know what real loss looked like. Because now I was not just an heiress. I was the person who knew where to hit the hardest. I knew that financial fraud was only part of their plan. They would not accept defeat. And as I expected, a few weeks after the eviction, I received a summons. The Lewandowski family had officially filed a lawsuit with the court demanding that the will be declared invalid. The reason? Mr. Arthur was in an unstable mental state at the time of signing the document. This was absurd. I knew that on the day he signed the will, he was more sober and rational than anyone in this family had ever been in their entire life. I gathered the entire legal team. My lawyer looked calm. "They have no chance, but they will play dirty." "I'm not afraid," I said. At the first meeting, they showed up in full force. Marina, in a black suit, with a show of sorrow on her face. Dasha, with fake tears and stories about the fading of her grandfather's mind. The nephews, with poorly memorized testimonies that Sophia manipulated him and kept him under control. I sat up straight, calmly, without a single emotion. When my lawyer turned on the video recording of Mr. Arthur clearly, confidently, and consciously voicing his will, the room fell silent. I know what I am doing, and I know to whom I leave everything. She is my pride, and none of the others deserve even a key to my office. The judge looked up. "Is there anything else?" I submitted another document. A medical certificate, signed by 3 independent doctors, stating that Mr. Arthur was in full mental and physical consciousness at the time of signing the will. The judge closed the case. The will remained in force. The family's claim was dismissed. After the hearing, Dasha caught up with me at the exit. "You've ruined everything," she hissed. I looked her in the eyes. "No, I didn't. You ruined everything when you decided that I would never raise my head." And I walked away. And she stayed behind, silent, humiliated, without an inheritance. And for the first time in her life, she knew what it was like to lose. After the trial, it was quiet. No calls. No messages. No attempts to talk like a human being. They disappeared. But I knew it was not the end. Just the silence after the verdict. The silence in which they watched themselves lose everything they were used to. The company, run by Arthur's nephew, was dependent on the accounts that were now frozen. Dasha, who had been living on her father's money, was forced to move to a rented apartment. Marina could no longer afford her status lifestyle. She lost both her real estate and access to investors. But that was not the most painful thing. They were not just left without money. They were left without a name. The press got wind of the case. The Lewandowski family lost their inheritance to their own maid. The millionaire's grandchildren wanted to kick the girl out, and now they are asking for her forgiveness. Sensation, a will in favor of a girl who was considered a nobody. I didn't comment on anything. I just lived, for the first time, for myself. But one morning I saw a familiar face on the cameras. Marina. She was standing at the gate. No makeup, with an old backpack. I went out alone, without a guard. What are you doing here? I have nowhere to go. Her voice was quiet, broken. And what do you want? Just to see the house. One last time. I was silent for a long time. And then I said, now you know what it's like to stand behind a door that will never open again. She just lowered her eyes, and I left without looking back. Now they knew what it was like to be in my shoes. And even that was enough. I was silent for a long time. For years. I swallowed my insults. I lived between walls that did not belong to me. I cleaned up after those who laughed in my face. But now everything has changed. I am the heiress. I am the owner. I am the one they were afraid of, even though they did not recognize me. And although I did not seek publicity, the story began to take on a life of its own. Journalists wrote articles. Bloggers discussed the case. People on social media supported me without even knowing me personally. A girl who grew up in a laundromat now owns a whole estate. The grandchildren lost millions because of their arrogance. Silent revenge is the worst. At first, I avoided attention. And then I agreed to a short interview. I did not blame him. I did not humiliate. I did not shout. I just told the truth. I didn't want revenge. I wanted to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. But when disrespect crosses the line, silence is no longer an option. And do you know what happened next? Hundreds of messages, thousands of comments. People with similar stories began to share their pain. I realized that my story was not just mine. This is the story of everyone who has been devalued, who was called nothing, who was told to sit and be quiet. And now I knew. I am no longer silent, and I will not allow anyone who has experienced the same thing to be silent. A month passed after my interview. Life went on around them, but for them, it was just beginning. Dasha lost her job. Her name became toxic. Marina was forced to sell her last jewelry to pay the rent. The nephews left the country, fleeing from the shame. And then they started coming back, one by one. First, they sent letters. They wrote about remorse, about reckless behavior, about how Grandpa would not want us to be at odds. Then came the calls. I didn't answer the phone. And finally, Marina came in person. She stood at the gate, just like then, but this time with her eyes down. I went out alone, without a guard. May I? She asked quietly. I nodded. We sat down on a bench in the garden where I used to sweep the leaves. I was cruel. We all were. Yes. I just didn't realize it would happen, that Grandpa, that he would choose you. Did you ever wonder why he did? She didn't say anything. Because he saw who was who. When everyone was looking at the outward appearance, he saw the essence. Marina bowed her head. I'm sorry. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to say it out loud. I took a breath. I could forgive, but I can't forget. She nodded. She stood up and walked away, without a word. And I felt not anger, not triumph. I felt silence. Deep, strong silence. Because now I knew. I was not taking revenge. I was defending myself. I did not humiliate. I showed the truth. And most importantly, I survived. They asked for forgiveness, and I have forgiven them long ago. But I will not allow anyone to return to my life to break it again. 3 months passed. I no longer lived in the shadow of other people's decisions. I was no longer silent in the corners. I didn't hide behind other people's backs. I walked the same corridors I used to run down with a bucket and a rag. I sat in the same office where I was not even allowed to stop. I opened the same books in the library, but now, as their rightful owner, I became the head of a charity foundation that I named in honor of my mother. I started a program to support girls from disadvantaged families who had been humiliated or neglected. I invested money not in pathos, but in education, help, and development. And what is surprising is that I did not feel that I had won the battle, because it was no longer about them. It was about me. About the girl who had been called a servant, shadow, nothing for years. About the one who silently endured, built herself up in secret, hoping for nothing. And in the end, she became the person they thought she was the least. A person who survived. A person who did not break. A person who turned humiliation into strength. And when I passed by the mirror in the hall, which used to reflect only my fatigue, I now saw myself in it. Not a maid, not a girl without a voice, but a woman who knows who she is, and will never allow herself to be humiliated again. This was my home, my life, my story, and it was just beginning.